Hello and welcome back to LP's LP of Paper Mario the Thousand-Year Door. For the greater part of the last 2 months, I have played and uploaded an episode of this game every single day. And it's due to this fact that I've developed a few opinions on the 8 chapters that make up the entirety of the grand adventure that is this game. What's the best chapter? What's the worst? Let's dig in right now, starting with number 8. Chapter 6, 3 Days of Excess. And before I get into my reasoning and brief overview of the chapter, I do feel it important to mention that I liked all of these chapters. I thoroughly enjoyed my experiences with all of them. The characters, the battles, the whole kit and caboodle was very entertaining to me. But I didn't particularly love this chapter as well as I loved the remaining ones after it. You see, you spend a good portion of the time this chapter on a train. And that's not inherently bad, but it does kind of hinder the sense of exploration that you kind of feel in other chapters. You see, you start off in said train, the XS Express, and you help a penguin detective called Pennington to identify some suspects and shady happenings, and all that's well and good, but I'm just not particularly a fan of murder mysteries. Maybe it's me. Maybe I'm the weird one. Goodness knows I'm at least a little bit weird, so this is probably no different. Coming in at 7, Chapter 2, The Great Boggly Tree. Now, this is a chapter that I feel like a number of people have told me that they didn't love either. It's the first real exposure to the X-Nauts, and it's your first actual battle with Lord Crump, and to that effect, it is noteworthy for that reason. However, traversing the Great Tree with Madame Flurry and all of her blowing abilities is entertaining to a certain extent. However, once you become in charge of all of the punies, and in charge of keeping them in order, and in charge of not losing them, well, you see where I'm going with this. Inevitably, I ended up losing some punies and had to reroute myself to find them throughout the tree, and it ended up being a tedious bit of process that can be avoided if you go back to the puny elder and call them back to her. But my problem is that I would go back and call them, and then I'd lose them by the time I got to the next place I was trying to get to. All in all, though, you receive the Emerald Star upon defeating Lord Crump, and it's a decent chapter in its own right. I really do enjoy the color of it all, how it's all very black and white, and it's very unique in that regard. More so, you get to spend a little bit of time with Princess Peach and Tech, where the computer starts to learn the emotion of love, and that little bit of character development for the inanimate object makes this a pretty neat experience. Ranking number 6, Chapter 4, For Pigs the Bell Tolls. Chapter 4 sees us adventure into Twilight Town, where everyone is pigging out. Not in the traditional sense, of course. You see, everyone's actually being afflicted or cursed by some mysterious entity who wants to turn everyone into bacon. I'm not actually sure why. It doesn't seem to actually go into too much depth as far as said character's motivations, but ultimately we apprehend said character spending some time as a shade of Mario himself, which was an interesting experience once I grasped what exactly was happening. The character, Dupless that is, takes Mario, takes his name, his body, and all of his friends, and ultimately turns them against Mario, assaulting him with the people that he had grown to love over the beginning half of the adventure. You also get a neat move, the paper tube, toilet paper maneuver, where you're able to go underneath things rolled up in a neat little spiral, and you end up even battling a optional boss if you have the wherewithal to smack all the boos inside of the creepy steeple. Altogether, it's not a terribly difficult adventure, but it does offer a certain amount of backtracking that makes it a little bit tougher than it ordinarily would be. All things considered, though, upon receipt of the Ruby Star, you go back to Princess Peach, and you even get to spend some time after the fact as Bowser underwater. And that fact alone bumps this thing up a couple of places in my ranking, because that is a good freaking time. A swimming lizard? I mean, come on. How can you dislike that? Coming in at number 5, we have Chapter 3 of Glitz and Glory. Now, I expect to catch some flack here from a number of people because a lot of people have told me that this is their favorite chapter, or at least in the upper echelon of chapters for them. And I don't necessarily disagree, right? As I mentioned earlier in the video, I liked all of these chapters. And Of Glitz and Glory is no different, right? It's a very linear chapter where you're doing almost one thing over and over and over again, and that one thing is competing in the Glitz Pit. You're fighting enemies, you're cracking skulls, you're jumping on innocent little Goombas who only are out there to earn a paycheck for their starving families. However, that aside, you do end up becoming the champion, and that's rewarding in and of itself, even taking down a Super Saiyan, aka Macho Grubba, in pursuit of the Crystal Star. Ultimately, you free the spirits that Macho Grubba was housing inside of the Crystal Star or inside of his machine used by power through the Crystal Star, and that leaves us all with a feel-good moment and a family reunion at the end. And speaking of family, you get a son in this chapter. You hatch a child. The egg that was destined to be a topping for a hot dog ends up not on a tasty little glizzy, but instead on Mario's hip. Dubbing himself Yoshi Jr. in my Let's Play, he referred to us as the Great Gonzalez, and we had a grand old time, ultimately becoming, I believe, my favorite partner in the entire game. Number 4, Chapter 5, The Key to Pirates. Chapter 5 sees you go on a nice tropical vacation, except by vacation you're more or less shipwrecked. And while the tropical part does hold up, unfortunately, the vacation aspect, like I mentioned, does seem to go by the wayside. You end up having to explore a cavern which is inhabited by the pirate ghost Cortez, who's a pretty sweet character in his own right. A very fun boss fight at the culmination of the chapter is probably the highlight of this whole experience, and I only have it ranked this high because I'm kind of biased towards tropical locations in video games. I don't know what it is. I mean, I live in Florida, so maybe that's kind of why. But I just really, really, really enjoy the colorful, islandy sort of situation that you find yourself in when traversing this island being Keel Hall Key. You also, of course, get a very neat black chest demon ability, which allows you to transform into a sailboat. Now, I don't know about you, but if I could morph my body and contort it in ways that allow me to float upon the water in some sort of boat-like form, I mean, that's pretty awesome, right? Like, how do you dislike that? I mean, of course, I probably could morph myself like that, but I'd die. So if you could do that while living, then hey, more power to you. This chapter ultimately concludes with Princess Peach streaking through Grodus's hideout, running rampant naked through the halls. Thankfully, she is invisible, able to get some reconnaissance done for us and our team and learn a few things about how we can hopefully progress deeper into the story. Coming in at number 3, we have Chapter 7, Mario Shoots the Moon. This chapter sees Mario and his allies head to far outposts in the wintry wonderland that houses all of the Eastern European bob-ombs. Now, you do have to partake in a really tedious quest to find a certain bob-omb, but that's easily set aside by the excellent cutscene that unravels shortly after, which of course sends you to the freaking moon. I mean, that's crazy. That's awesome. Mario on the moon without a helmet. Mario does not need oxygen. That alone makes this an incredible experience, but what's more, you get to infiltrate the X-Nauts fortress, which, alongside an excellent theme song, is just a really, really fun experience. To explore the same place that you had been traversing as Princess Peach in prior chapters, as Mario and co., easily stomping on the foreheads of all of the scholars and hourly workers that Grodus is employing, walking your way backwards all the way to Magnus von Grapple once more, garnering the second to last Crystal Star. Coming in at number 2, we have the very first chapter, Castle in Dragon. Now, this may be a little bit unconventional. I'm not actually sure how people view all these chapters at all, save for a handful. But the first chapter to me stands out because it was the one chapter I had remembered the most from my first playthrough as a child. And really, it's hard for me to to not love the first chapter of any experience? I love the Fellowship of the Ring. I love the first Harry Potter. I love A New Hope. I love A Phantom Menace. I mean, they're kind of both episode 1s in a way, right? A New Hope was the original first one, but it was technically episode 4. I mean, that aside, I love the onset of the adventure. I really just enjoy that whole sense of wonder, sense of adventure. You don't know what's going to happen. And in this game, that's much the same, except the first thing you deal with is a friggin' dragon. I mean, dragons are awesome. Dragons are terrifying. Dragons are lizards that breathe freaking fire, and I don't know how much more impressive of a start it can have other than starting off with you killing one. So, you also get, your first couple of party members, and that's very cool in all of itself. But really, I attribute this ranking to it primarily for it being the first chapter and setting an extremely strong impression in my mind. And number 1, we have Chapter 8, The Thousand-Year Door. Now, I find it interesting that my top 2 were both the first and last chapters. I don't really have anything else to say beyond that, but we'll dig into the final chapter here. It's great. It ties a bow on everything that we've experienced throughout the course of this adventure very, very nicely. You get to battle a host of enemies that you'd seen across the way. You get to re-battle certain bosses that you'd seen across the way. You get to battle the family members of certain bosses you faced along the way. And it wraps up with an excellent twist that M. Night Shyamalan himself couldn't have thought up in a million years, probably because he doesn't write for Nintendo and he would never use these characters. But that point aside, it's a great time. It really, really, really is. It brings everything home, and what's more is that it doesn't actually just cut it off. There's more. You can come back to Rogueport. You can continue to play, and while that may not necessarily be part of Chapter 8, I lump it in as well because it's the final part of the game. The bulk of Chapter 8 is spent exploring this Palace of Shadows, right? And it's similar in a way to many other past Mario games. It's filled with fire, it's filled with evil, and ultimately it culminates in a final boss battle. Well, this one differs a little. As I mentioned earlier, there's several boss battles, and if you are well equipped to partake in all of those, you're gonna have a great time. If you're not well equipped, well, you might not have as great of a time, but you certainly can still appreciate the masterpiece of a story that ends up culminating there. So, that's what I think of the 8 chapters of The Thousand Door. I think there's a definitive ranking. And again, that's not to say that any of them are bad. If I had to rank these from a scale of 1 to 10, I think that Chapter 6, which I had as the worst, still sets in at like a 7 out of 10. Well, I still really enjoyed it. I would replay it right now. But that aside, this is just the order in which I have them set. What about you? What's your favorite chapter of Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door? What's your least favorite? If you have the time, give me the full ranking. I'd love to hear it. Either which way, I'm just glad you were here to wrap up my daily Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door episode series. There's not going to be one of these tomorrow. Like I said earlier in the video, I've been uploading a video for this game every single day for the greater part of 2 months. And I am sad to see it come to an end. But this is not the end for Paper Mario on the channel, nor is it even the end for Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door. There will be at least one more Thousand-Year Door video on the channel at a later date. As for Paper Mario itself, well, I have some ideas there, but you're going to have to head on over to the Patreon to really understand them. Either which way, thank you again for watching. I sincerely appreciate it, and I hope that you enjoyed yourself. And with that said, I'll see you tomorrow.